When Karen called the cops on my backyard BBQ, I thought it would ruin the night. But what she didn't realize was that she had just started a war, and by the time it was over, the entire neighborhood would be laughing while she was left humiliated, exposed, and powerless. This is the story of how one Karen tried to ruin a simple cookout, and how I got the last laugh. The BBQ that started it lit was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that begged for a backyard barbecue. The smell of charcoal, sizzling meat, and sweet corn on the grill drifted through the air as families gathered in their yards. Kids played on bikes, and neighbors enjoyed the sunshine. For most people, it was the perfect weekend moment. But for one neighbor, it was a nightmare. And her name was Karen, the homeowner. Proud of his house and the little backyard he worked so hard to maintain, had invited family over for a small cookout. Nothing excessive, just burgers, hot dogs, corn, and a few lawn chairs scattered across the grass. The sound of laughter carried through the air, along with music playing quietly from a speaker. It was cheerful, but not disruptive, at least not to anyone reasonable. Karen lived 3 doors down, in a spotless white house with curtains always drawn tightly shut. She was infamous in the neighborhood, the self-proclaimed protector of community standards. She complained about kids leaving bikes on the sidewalk, about cars parked an inch too close to her driveway, and about trash cans being left out for more than a few hours after pickup. She thrived on confrontation, convinced that she alone enforced order in the neighborhood. So when she caught a whiff of barbecue smoke, she was already furious. To her, it wasn't just a cookout. It was an attack on her peace. The first sign of trouble came when she appeared at the edge of the yard, arms folded, lips pursed tightly together. She stood there, glaring for several minutes, like a hawk watching prey. The guests noticed, whispering among themselves, but the homeowner brushed it off. This wasn't the first time Karen had lurked. He figured she'd eventually go back inside, but he underestimated just how determined she was to ruin the day. Karen returned to her house, and for a short while, the party went on in peace. Food was served, laughter grew louder, and the day seemed to brighten. But then, sirens. A police car rolled down the street and stopped right in front of the house. The music stopped. Conversations hushed. Everyone turned their heads as 2 officers stepped out, their faces calm but serious. The homeowner walked over, confused and concerned. Why were the police here? It didn't take long to find out. Karen had called them, claiming the barbecue was a public disturbance and accusing the family of violating city ordinances. She told the police there was smoke pollution, noise complaints, and even illegal activity happening in the yard. Of course, the officers quickly realized none of this was true. The barbecue was perfectly lawful. The music was within acceptable limits. The smoke was minimal and completely normal for outdoor cooking. Still, the interruption put a damper on the gathering. The homeowner was embarrassed, his guests uncomfortable, and the joyful energy of the afternoon was disrupted. Karen, meanwhile, watched from her window with smug satisfaction. She believed she had won, that she had asserted her control once again. But what she didn't realize was that this moment would mark the beginning of a much larger battle, a battle she wouldn't win. The homeowner tried to shake it off, determined not to let her ruin his day. But deep down, something had shifted. He realized this wasn't just about a barbecue. It was about principle. Karen had crossed a line, and there had to be consequences. As the day wound down and guests began leaving, he stood in the yard, staring at Karen's closed blinds. He wasn't angry in the way she wanted him to be. He wasn't defeated. Instead, he was calculating. He thought about every time she had harassed neighbors, every time she had inserted herself into situations that had nothing to do with her. He remembered the countless stories others in the community had shared about her antics. This time, he decided things would be different. This time, he wasn't going to let it slide. The embers of the barbecue cooled in the grill, but in his mind, a fire had been lit. He was going to get the last laugh, no matter how long it took. And that's where the story truly begins. Because what Karen didn't know was that her attempt to ruin one simple barbecue would spark a chain of events that would expose her hypocrisy, unravel her influence in the neighborhood, and leave her with a humiliation she'd never forget. The first step was to learn her patterns, to understand exactly how she operated. and to gather the stories of others who had suffered at her hands. And with that, the homeowner began planning. The barbecue was over, but the real feast was yet to come. Digging into Karen's past after the police left and the last guest walked out the gate, the homeowner sat alone in the backyard, replaying the afternoon in his mind. The embarrassment of having law enforcement show up to a harmless family barbecue wasn't something he could easily shake off. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was insulting. Karen had weaponized the system to try to humiliate him in front of his family and friends. But if Karen had taught him anything that day, it was that she thrived on people staying quiet. She relied on neighbors being too busy, too polite, or too timid to push back. That was how she had gotten away with years of petty harassment. But this time, she had picked the wrong person. He wasn't going to forget, and he wasn't going to forgive. The very next morning, he started digging, not literally but into Karen's history in the neighborhood. He began with casual conversations. A jog around the block turned into a chat with a neighbor trimming hedges. A walk to the mailbox became an opportunity to strike up small talk. He didn't need to push hard. People had plenty to say about Karen. Once they realized someone was actually interested in listening, the stories came out quickly. One neighbor described how Karen had filed a noise complaint because their wind chimes were too distracting. Another recalled how she once measured the height of their grass with a ruler and threatened to call the HOA over it. A family down the street revealed she had harassed them about their holiday decorations, claiming that flashing lights were a hazard. Every tale followed the same pattern: Karen inserting herself where she didn't belong, escalating minor inconveniences into full-blown battles, and always claiming she was protecting the neighborhood. But the homeowner wanted more than stories. He wanted evidence. That's when he discovered the online HOA forum. Buried in the association's website, there was a complaint log that members could access. It wasn't flashy, just a spreadsheet of dates, addresses, and vague notes. But there it was, Karen's fingerprints all over the neighborhood. Dozens of complaints, some anonymous, some signed. Parking violations, noise complaints, trash violations, lawn citations, nearly all traced back to her address. She had been filing grievances against neighbors for years, clogging the system with petty disputes. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't a victim of bad neighbors, she was the problem, and she had left a paper trail long enough to expose her. The homeowner started collecting everything he could: screenshots of complaint logs, stories from neighbors willing to go on record, photos of harmless things she had exaggerated into violations. Piece by piece, he built a file that revealed the truth. Karen wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was terrorizing it. But it wasn't enough to simply know the truth. He wanted to hit her where it hurt her reputation. Because for Karen, being seen as the moral authority of the community wasn't just a hobby. It was her identity. Stripping that away would be the ultimate revenge. As the days passed, he noticed Karen's patterns more closely. She patrolled the block like a watchdog, peering from behind her blinds or strolling the sidewalk with a phone in hand. She always looked for infractions, big or small, to justify her sense of control. But what she didn't notice was that now, someone was watching her. The homeowner kept his distance, but he made sure to record her behavior whenever possible. The way she photographed other people's yards, the way she lingered outside houses, taking notes like some self-appointed detective. Every strange action became another piece of the puzzle. It was a slow process, but patience was key. He knew that rushing in without preparation would only give Karen another opportunity to twist the narrative. He had to be deliberate. And then, just when he thought he had enough to work with, fate handed him a gift. One evening, as he was walking his dog past Karen's house, he noticed her front yard. For years she had complained about others breaking the smallest of HOA rules: trash cans, weeds, minor decorations. Yet there it was, her own trash bin left out overnight, weeds creeping through the cracks of her sidewalk, and a faded, chipped fence she had never bothered to maintain. She had been violating the very rules she weaponized against everyone else. It was the kind of hypocrisy that could turn the tide of the neighborhood against her. If she could dish out punishment, but couldn't follow her own rules, then her authority would crumble. And with the evidence he had already gathered, this was the final piece he needed. The plan was taking shape. He wasn't going to shout or argue with her in the street. He wasn't going to call the cops like she did. He was going to expose her carefully, publicly, and in a way she couldn't deny. But exposure alone wouldn't be enough. He wanted her downfall to be unforgettable. He wanted her to feel the same humiliation she had inflicted on so many others. The question now was simple: how to deliver the blow. And as he considered his options, an idea began to form, an idea that would require the cooperation of his neighbors. For years they had suffered in silence, but maybe, just maybe, they would rally together. If someone finally took the lead, the barbecue had been Karen's attempt to put him in his place. But now, he was planning something much bigger. And when the time came, Karen would never see it coming. Rallying the neighborhood, the homeowner knew that one person alone couldn't topple a titan of petty power. Karen's control came from isolation. Neighbors whispered stories, but rarely acted. She counted on that silence. So his next move was simple and strategic: build a coalition. Not a mob, not something loud and chaotic. A careful network of people who had been personally impacted and were ready to reclaim their block from petty tyranny. He began with the neighbors who had shown the most visible frustration over the years, the ones whose eyes betrayed annoyance whenever Karen's curtains twitched. He knocked on doors with a calm demeanor, presented his carefully assembled evidence, and asked a single question: would they be willing to join an effort to expose the truth? The answer was almost always yes. People were tired of calls at midnight, of passive-aggressive notes on windshields, of the anxiety that came with every holiday decoration or weekend gathering. Word spread quickly enough that the homeowner had to manage expectations. He made no promises about dramatic confrontations or public shaming. Instead, he outlined a plan grounded in procedure and community pressure, two things Karen feared most, because they threatened the narrative she had constructed. He proposed a neighborhood meeting to present the facts, a public record that could not be dismissed as hearsay. He suggested documenting violations by her in a way that mirrored her own methods, photos, dates, and witnesses. If she had weaponized the HOA and the police before, they would weaponize transparency now. The first meeting was small but determined. They met in the cool of the evening at the local park, under the forgiving shadow of a playground that had seen too many arguments. For such a peaceful spot, people came with stories and evidence, screenshots from the whole forum, blurry photos of wind chimes she had complained about, copies of anonymous letters she had sent, timelines of petty harassment, and the homeowner's newly compiled record of her own violations. There was a sense of release in the way people spoke when they knew someone was finally listening. Years of resentment exhaled in an organized, focused way. They agreed on three things. First, they would create a formal complaint to the HOA, consolidating the disparate annoyances into a single, coherent, and documented case. Second, they would establish a neighborhood watch of sorts to document Karen's activity in a manner that could be submitted as evidence if needed. Third, and most important, they would use social pressure and community events to undercut her influence, subtle, strategic actions that eroded her authority without resorting to the same malicious tactics she used. The homeowner divided tasks. Someone collected statements from frightened families. Another neighbor, who worked in administration, helped organize the paperwork so it was medically precise, leaving no room for the kind of ambiguity Karen relied on. A tech-savvy college student volunteered to map the timeline of her complaints and link them to the homes she targeted. The plan was methodical, legal, and painfully effective. As they prepared, the homeowner understood the psychological stakes. Karen's persona was built on being taken seriously. She had convinced herself and many others that she was the defender of order. If the neighborhood began to view her as a vexatious complainer instead, her power would sink like a ship with a leaking hull. So their campaign was twofold: gather evidence and stage an alternate narrative. They would show not just that she filed complaints, but that she used those complaints to intimidate and manipulate neighbors. That was where the humiliation would come, not from ridicule, but from the collapse of credibility. They also prepared for retaliation. Karen was predictable in her aggression. She escalated when cornered. The homeowner advised restraint and documentation. If she called the police again, they would have records. If she filed suit, they would have witnesses. The community would not be baited into mirroring her vindictiveness. Instead, they planned to be relentless with the truth, calm, thorough, indisputable. The homeowner's evidence revealed patterns that had been invisible when viewed as isolated incidents. There were clusters of complaints filed the week after certain families hosted gatherings. There were precise measurements made only to catch children's play equipment. The HOA spreadsheet, once dry and dull, transformed into a dossier of obsession. It became clear that Karen didn't police the neighborhood out of concern for safety or aesthetics. She policed it for control and the rush of authority that came with it. With their dossier complete, the group scheduled a formal hearing with the HOA board. The homeowner felt the weight of the moment. He imagined the room, the faces of the board members who had either turned a blind eye or been sucked into Karen's orbit. He thought about the families who had been silent for years because they feared escalation. He thought about his own barbecue, the way laughter had been interrupted by flashing lights and officers' boots on the pavement. That humiliation had become a promise to himself. Things would change. The hearing itself was a study in procedural theater. The HOA board listened with the politeness of people used to diffusing petty squabbles. Then the homeowner presented the case. He walked them through the timeline, laid out photographs of Karen's own violations, and placed the complaint log on the table like a slow-acting explosive. He did not shout. He did not plead. He spoke with a methodical clarity that made it hard to dodge the truth. The board members flipped through the documents. Their smiles faded into concern. One by one, their body language shifted. The homeowner could read the subtle recalibration they were processing what it meant to have their community's processes weaponized by one resident. The board did what boards do when faced with real evidence. They asked for time to investigate. That request felt like progress. It also bought them cover from Karen's inevitable accusation that the homeowner was launching a smear campaign. But the homeowner had planned for that too. He had distributed copies of the dossier to neighbors and posted a summarized version on the HOA's online discussion board. Transparency was the hammer. If Karen tried to claim defamation, she would be attacking a public record and the testimony of multiple witnesses. As word of the HOA complaint spread, the neighborhood began to shift in subtle ways. People who had previously walked past Karen's house with heads down started waving again. Families resumed small gatherings, testing the boundaries like a child dipping a toe into a lake. There was cautious joy in those tentative reunions. It felt like sunlight breaking through a long winter of microaggressions. But the homeowner never mistook momentum for victory. Karen was not someone who gave up easily. She watched, of course, from the windows with that same expression that had haunted the barbecue. She reacted predictably, narrowing her complaints, sending suspiciously polite emails to the HOA about process and fairness. When the board called for mediation discussions, she arrived armed with her own carefully curated list of grievances. The homeowner expected this. His confidence came from knowing they had prepared 3 steps ahead: documentation, witnesses, and a public narrative. A turning point came when a retired school teacher, a woman who had been quiet for years, stepped forward with a statement that crystallized the neighbors' frustration. She testified to the corrosive effect of constant surveillance on community life. She explained how children stopped playing freely and how neighbors stopped inviting each other over out of fear of reprisal. The words were measured, but they landed like a heavy door closing on a long-standing secret. Those words, combined with the physical evidence, moved the board to act. Their first action was administrative, but symbolic: a formal letter to Karen, warning that frivolous and vindictive complaints violated HOA policy and could result in sanctions. The homeowner felt a small, private satisfaction reading the letter. It was procedural, not cruel, but it struck at the core of her power the perception that she could use official channels as a personal weapon. The homeowner knew this was just the beginning. The letter might not stop her completely, but it announced a new reality. The neighborhood would not let one person hijack their lives. At night, when the house settled and the quiet returned, he thought about how fragile authority can be when it rests on fear. Karen had built a kingdom of control on petty complaints and social isolation. The homeowner and his neighbors had dismantled it with diligence, patience, and the slow work of truth. The retaliation might come, but it would come against a new force, one bound by shared experience and documented evidence. The block had started to breathe again. The homeowner imagined future barbecues without flashing lights, future holidays without whispered threats. He imagined children playing until dusk and neighbors bringing chairs into driveways and staying late, unafraid. That future felt within reach, and it was motivating in a way that mere revenge was not. This was about community reclamation. The next step was the most public and satisfying part of the plan. They needed to make the revelations about Karen impossible to ignore, to frame the narrative not as personal vendetta, but as collective defense. The homeowner and his cohort began crafting the final move, a neighborhood-wide event that would symbolically end intimidation. It would be visible, joyful, and impossible to disparage as petty. It would be their way of getting the last laugh, but more importantly, their way of reclaiming life from a neighbor who preferred control to community. And as the plan for that event took shape, the homeowner thought about the nature of small-town power. It was fragile when faced with unity, and once it started to crack, it often crumbled faster than anyone expected. Karen would see the fracture, and she would react. He only hoped that when she did, the neighborhood would remain calm, composed, and unbowed. The block party ambushed homeowners' plan for the ultimate move came to life in the form of something deceptively simple: a neighborhood block party. On the surface, it was innocent, a weekend of grilling, games, music, and community bonding. But beneath that festive exterior, it was a strategic strike designed to strip Karen of her grip on the neighborhood once and for all. The choice of a block party wasn't random. It was deliberate, a direct inversion of the moment that started everything. Karen had tried to ruin one man's barbecue. Now, the entire neighborhood would come together for the biggest barbecue she had ever seen, loud, joyful, and undeniably lawful. It was a symbolic retaking of space and spirit, a demonstration that the community wouldn't bend to her intimidation anymore. Preparations began quietly but spread quickly. Families pooled resources: grills, tents, folding tables, and coolers. Kids made hand-drawn signs advertising lemonade stands and face painting. Someone volunteered a projector for outdoor movies after dark. The retired school teacher who had spoken at the HOA hearing offered to organize games for children. Every contribution was a subtle defiance, a piece of joy built in opposition to Karen's reign of complaints. But the real masterstroke was the way they used transparency. Weeks before the event, flyers were circulated through mailboxes and taped to streetlight posts. The homeowner also posted the announcement on the HOA's online forum. Everything was above board, permitted, documented, and impossible for Karen to label as unlawful. If she tried to interfere, it wouldn't be a lone homeowner against her accusations. It would be her against the entire neighborhood, with paperwork to back it up. The day of the block party arrived under a perfect sky. By noon, the street was lined with canopies. The smell of barbecue smoke curled into the air, and laughter spilled from every yard. Music played, children darted across the pavement with chalk and bubbles, and adults mingled with a freedom that had been absent for too long. It was more than a party, it was a reclamation. Karen, of course, noticed immediately. Her blinds twitched violently from the moment the first grill was lit. Soon, she appeared at the edge of her driveway, arms folded tight, her lips pressed into the same thin line she had worn at the original barbecue. She stood like a storm cloud among sunshine, radiating disapproval. For a while, she simply glared. But glaring was never enough for Karen. Not long after, she pulled out her phone. Neighbors watched discreetly as she gestured and paced, her voice sharp and animated. It was obvious she was calling the police again, reporting yet another disturbance. This time, however, the homeowner and his allies were ready. They had permits for street closure, approvals for the gathering, and documentation proving the event was fully authorized. When the police arrived, the music quieted but didn't stop. People kept grilling, children kept playing, and the crowd welcomed the officers with calm, confident smiles. The homeowner stepped forward with the permits in hand, presenting them before Karen could even launch into her tirade. The officers glanced over the papers, looked around at the cheerful scene, and shook their heads. They told Karen everything was lawful and left without another word. The neighborhood erupted in quiet, restrained celebration, not wild cheering, but knowing glances and suppressed grins. Karen had tried her usual tactic, and it had failed publicly. The police hadn't scolded anyone this time. They had scolded her, indirectly, by leaving without validating her complaint. The humiliation was written across her face as she retreated to her porch, muttering under her breath, but the event didn't end there. The real blow came later that evening, when the community projected a slideshow onto a sheet stretched across a garage door. At first, it was framed as a history of the neighborhood, old photos of houses, kids riding bikes, holiday events from years past. Laughter rippled through the crowd as people recognized themselves and their families. Then came the shift. Without fanfare, the slideshow transitioned into a series of images documenting Karen's hypocrisy, her trash bins, left out, her chipped fence, her weed-strewn sidewalk. Nothing malicious, nothing exaggerated, just plain evidence, presented alongside her long record of complaints from the whole log. The message was subtle but devastating. While she had hounded others for minor imperfections, she had ignored her own. The audience reacted with murmurs, headshakes, and sighs of disbelief. It wasn't cruel mockery, it was collective recognition of truth. Karen's credibility as the protector of standards crumbled in real time. From her porch, Karen shouted accusations of slander and harassment, but her words carried no weight. The slideshow wasn't gossip, it was fact. It wasn't cruel laughter at her expense, it was a mirror she could no longer avoid. For once, the neighborhood wasn't cowed by her rage. They turned back to the barbecue, the music, the games, and the laughter, leaving her to stew in her own isolation. That night, as lanterns glowed and children watched cartoons projected onto the garage, the homeowner reflected on the transformation. The block had united not through anger but through joy, through a shared commitment to reclaiming what Karen had stolen from them: peace, freedom, and community. But he also knew something important: Karen wasn't finished. Humiliation might wound her, but it wouldn't silence her. People like Karen didn't fade quietly. They escalated. They doubled down. And sure enough, as the party wound down and the last embers of the grills glowed, the homeowner spotted her again at her window, phone in hand, typing furiously. Whatever she was plotting next, it was already in motion. The neighborhood had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Karen's desperation. The morning after the block party, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, almost celebratory, as if the barbecue smoke had carried away years of tension. People waved at each other more freely. Children played without watchful eyes darting toward Karen's house, and conversations flowed on sidewalks where silence once reigned. The block party hadn't just been a gathering. It had been liberation. But in the quiet of her shuttered home, Karen was seething. Her attempt to summon the police had backfired in front of the entire neighborhood, and her credibility had crumbled when the slideshow revealed her hypocrisy. She was no longer the enforcer she once pretended to be. She was the spectacle, and for Karen, humiliation was intolerable. The homeowner expected retaliation, and he wasn't wrong. Within days, new complaints began circulating through the whole forum. Anonymous posts accused neighbors of littering, breaking noise ordinances, and violating property codes. The language was sharp and exaggerated, dripping with the same vindictive tone Karen had always used. No one doubted the source, even if her name wasn't attached. But Karen didn't stop there. She escalated. She began sending long, rambling emails to the HOA board, accusing them of corruption and bias. She claimed the block party was an illegal gathering that endangered public health and safety. She accused the homeowner of orchestrating a smear campaign against her. Each message was more frantic than the last, filled with capital letters and desperate pleas for action. The board, already weary of her history, acknowledged the complaints but did not act. Their patience was thin, and the evidence compiled by the homeowner and his neighbors weighed heavily against her credibility. Still, Karen's desperation pushed her into more reckless territory. Late one evening, several families reported seeing her walking through the neighborhood with a flashlight, pointing it into yards, scribbling notes, and muttering to herself. Some claim she even tried to peek over fences, searching for violations in the dark. Her behavior shifted from annoying to unsettling. It wasn't just petty anymore. It was obsessive. The homeowner documented it all. Videos taken discreetly from porches showed her prowling the sidewalks, flashlight beam cutting across driveways. Screenshots captured the increasingly unhinged rants she posted in online forums. Every move she made only tightened the case against her. But the breaking point came when she made a critical mistake. In her frenzy to reassert control, Karen staged what she thought was a brilliant maneuver. She placed several bags of trash at the edge of her neighbor's yard and took photos as if catching them red-handed. She submitted the photos to the HOA as evidence of a violation, demanding immediate fines and punishment. Unfortunately for her, the homeowner's security cameras caught the entire act, her dragging the bags across the street, arranging them neatly by the property line, and snapping pictures before scurrying back to her house. The footage was undeniable, and it revealed something much darker than petty complaints. It showed malicious intent, a deliberate attempt to fabricate evidence and punish innocent people. When the footage circulated through the neighborhood, the reaction was swift. Outrage replaced annoyance. What had once been brushed off as Karen being difficult was now recognized as sabotage. Families who had stayed quiet finally spoke up, submitting their own stories of harassment. The narrative shifted permanently. Karen wasn't the protector of the neighborhood. She was its tormentor. The HOA board could no longer ignore it. A special meeting was called, with attendance spilling beyond the usual handful of residents. The air buzzed with anticipation. The homeowner sat near the front, evidence in hand, while Karen marched in with a stack of papers and a scowl that could curdle milk. The meeting began with order, but it didn't stay orderly for long. The board played the security footage, and the room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and headshakes filled the hall as everyone watched Karen sabotage her neighbor's yard. Her credibility shattered before their eyes. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming the footage was doctored and that she was framed, but no one believed her. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too consistent, and the community too fed up. The board deliberated briefly before issuing its decision. Karen was officially sanctioned. She would be fined heavily for false reporting, barred from filing further complaints without direct review, and stripped of any influence within the HOA. It was the harshest punishment the board had ever handed down, and it marked the end of her reign. But Karen didn't take the decision quietly. She stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her, and her voice could be heard outside screaming threats of lawsuits and vengeance. The sound echoed across the parking lot, but inside, no one felt intimidated anymore. Instead, they felt relief. The homeowner sat back, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The plan had worked, and the neighborhood had finally stood up to her. But as much as it felt like victory, he knew the story wasn't finished yet. Karen's rage had only grown, and desperate people rarely walked away without one final attempt at chaos. And sure enough, within days, she would make her most reckless move yet. A move that wouldn't just humiliate her, it would ensure she could never recover her grip on the neighborhood again. The last laugh. Karen's sanction from the HOA should have been the end. Most people, faced with such overwhelming evidence and public humiliation, would have retreated into silence. But Karen wasn't most people. She thrived on control, and when that control slipped through her fingers, she didn't let go. She clawed, scratched, and thrashed for it until the bitter end. The neighborhood braced itself. For days after the hearing, Karen stayed unusually quiet. Her blinds were drawn, her driveway empty, and her porch barren. Some wondered if she was finally humbled. Others suspected she was plotting. The homeowner leaned toward the latter, and he was right. 1 week later, her final act arrived. It began with a letter thick, stapled, and shoved into every neighbor's mailbox. In it, Karen accused the HOA of corruption, the homeowner of running a conspiracy, and nearly half the block of moral decay. She claimed the block party was part of a campaign of intimidation against her, and that she would be pursuing legal action against anyone who participated. The letter was long, rambling, and filled with contradictions. What should have been a menacing threat instead read like a desperate manifesto. Neighbors laughed quietly when they read it. Some shook their heads. A few even pinned it on refrigerators as a bizarre trophy. But the homeowner knew Karen wouldn't stop at words. The letter was only the opening shot of her last stand. That her true plan unfolded the following weekend. Under the cover of night, She wheeled several large speakers onto her porch and cranked them to maximum volume. The noise was unbearable static, distorted music blasting across the neighborhood like an air raid siren. It was obvious what she was doing. If the community insisted on their block parties, she would give them a party they couldn't ignore. But what she hadn't anticipated was the preparation her neighbors had made. Months earlier, when the homeowner had rallied the block, they had discussed the possibility of escalation. They agreed then that any extreme behavior would be documented and reported collectively, to remove any chance of Karen framing it as personal persecution. So, as her speakers roared through the night, half a dozen phones captured the chaos from different angles. Within an hour, police arrived, not responding to a single complaint, but to a flood of them from nearly every household. Karen met the officers with her usual fury, shouting about conspiracies and persecution. But the officers didn't buy it. They saw the speakers, the recordings, and the neighborhood standing united. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the aggressor. The officers issued her a citation on the spot and ordered her to shut the noise down immediately. Still, Karen wasn't finished. Days later, she attempted her boldest and most foolish move. She called a town meeting in her front yard, blasting emails and posting flyers claiming she had evidence of corruption in the HOA, and urging everyone to attend. The homeowner and his neighbors showed up not to support her, but to witness the spectacle. Karen stood on her porch with a stack of papers, shouting accusations into the air. She waved her arms, pointing at neighbors by name, ranting about how they had betrayed her. But when she tried to present her so-called evidence, it crumbled instantly. Printouts of her own emails, rambling notes filled with half-finished sentences, and photographs taken out of context. Instead of proving corruption, it proved obsession. The crowd didn't jeer or shout her down. They simply walked away, one by one, until she was left screaming into the empty street. That was the true humiliation, not anger, not confrontation, but indifference. Her reign of fear ended not with a bang, but with silence. Word of the fiasco reached the HOA quickly. The board convened once more and delivered the final blow. Karen was removed from all committees, fined for repeated violations, and formally barred from filing complaints for the next 12 months. Her power was gone. She could yell, she could stew, she could mutter behind closed curtains, but she could no longer touch the lives of her neighbors. The homeowner didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't gloat or rub her downfall in her face. His victory was quieter, more satisfying than that. He reclaimed his barbecue. He reclaimed his freedom. And most importantly, he reclaimed his community. Weeks later, another barbecue took place in his backyard. The air smelled of charcoal and grilled food. Children laughed on the grass, and music floated gently through the evening. Neighbors gathered freely, talking and smiling, unafraid of flashing lights or sudden confrontations. For the first time in years, the block felt whole. And though Karen's blinds were still drawn, her windows dark, no one cared anymore. Her power had dissolved into the background noise of memory, nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered between new families who moved into the neighborhood. The homeowner sat in his chair, plate in hand, watching the people around him enjoy themselves. The laughter that filled the yard was louder than sirens, louder than complaints, louder than Karen ever could be. In the end, he had gotten exactly what he wanted, the last laugh, and it was shared by everyone.